Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Tom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast. I'm your host, Thom Jennings, and I know I sound like a broken record, which is ironic because I am a collector of records. But thanks to everyone for listening, for the feedback, for the constructive criticism, and all that kind of stuff that comes along with having a podcast. And when I started doing this, I had no real plan per se in terms of growing an audience other than to try to be as authentic as I possibly could. And I think that has served the podcast well. The interviews, I mean, last week we had an interview with Larry Snyder the third, and Larry was such a great guest. And Josh Kogovan before that, and you know, I've had so many just phenomenal guests. And one of the neat things about having somebody guest on your podcast is it gives you an opportunity to have a different type of conversation with them, and where you can dig a little bit deeper into what they're thinking, and maybe it makes you have a little bit more of an appreciation of them as an individual. And I mean, in the case of Josh, I mean, we not only did the podcast, we wound up having an opportunity to go to a concert together, and I think that was a really special moment. And maybe I'm feeling a little bit sentimental this week. On Saturday, I was reunited with somebody that I hadn't seen in, wow, it's got to be 30 or 35 years. And there's a guy named Will Vale, and Will and Willie, I used to call him Willie back then, but I guess he goes by Will now. And he came out to see a band that was playing at the place that I bartend at on weekends. And I mean, we knew each other from the time that we were wee lads, 5 years old. And it was just one of those moments where it's almost indescribable. And I'll start with maybe my original thoughts, which was fear. You know, when you don't see somebody for 30, 35 years, the first thing that goes into, at least my head, I don't know if I can speak for other people, is that fear that maybe they didn't value your friendship as much as you valued it, their friendship. And I mean, in the case of Will, I mean, he was somebody that I knew for a long time. I always loved the guy, just a big personality, just a sweet dude. And, you know, you think, oh, well, when he sees me, is it going to be one of those, yeah, hey, good to see you, man. It's been a while. You know, what's up with the kids, all that stuff. But we had this just really special, warm embrace, and it's one of those moments that really makes you feel good. Because I'll tell you, it on the opposite end of the spectrum, I remember there was this kid named David Graney who, I don't know why I remember this, but I went to grammar school with him. We were in, you know, kindergarten through fourth grade together. And then in my mid-20s, he came into a bar where I was bartending, and I saw him, and I was like, Dave, it's so cool to see you. And he's like, yeah, and who are you? So I mean, it's just this completely deflating moment. You know, you see somebody that you've missed, and you think that maybe they don't think the same about your friendship, and then in that case, it really was like, you know, obviously they didn't value me as an individual, or I don't know, maybe they suffered from some amnesia and they just didn't remember us. But that was kind of a heartbreaking moment. It really bothered me. But since then, I've really had this fear of running into people that I haven't seen in a long time and having them just be like, who cares? And I mean, if you go back in the archives, there was an episode with a guy named Dan Glover, and Dan was such an important part of my youth, and he had introduced me to all these live concerts and everything, and it was such a beautiful moment for us to be able to reunite via the podcast, and it was nice to know that he remembered me. And I don't know, where am I going with this? This is Bagel Logic, folks. You never know what path it will take you. But subject today, I wanted to talk about my mom, and she's been on my mind today. And you know, everybody's got a mom, as they say, and some people have really good moms, and some people have really bad moms, and some people have something in the middle there. But you know, yesterday, July 18th, I'm recording this on the 19th, was the 6th anniversary of my mom's passing. And I've really struggled with the period leading up to her passing or death, because as circumstances would happen, I was the person that wanted being her healthcare proxy. So as she got older and dealt with health issues in her 80s, and then when finally decisions needed to be made in terms of whether she goes into hospice or we seek aggressive healthcare treatment, that was on me. And it's a double-edged sword. Of the three kids, I'm the youngest. I have an older sister, Kathleen, a middle sister, Karen, who really I haven't been in any major contact with in many years. I don't know. It again, that's one of those things where it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier in the podcast, where like if my sister came to town now, the last time I saw her was at my mother's funeral. What would it be like? It would be, I'd love to have a situation where we could share a warm embrace, but I just don't see it happening. So you set yourself up for disappointment. But, Mom, my sister Kathleen, she went to Cornell University, then NYU Law, became a lawyer. She relocated to Atlanta, Georgia. And my sister Karen, she went to college in Oswego and then eventually in Rhode Island. And she met a guy in Rhode Island, and they eventually relocated to somewhere near Dallas, Texas. The town's Carrollton. I don't really know the story why they wound up there, but the point being that one sister that was in Dallas. I live in Western New York. My mom at the time was in Albion, New York, which is the town where I lived in, which is near Rochester, New York, and Buffalo, New York. And so it really comes down to I was the one that had to make the decisions because of proximity. I'm the kid that's closest. And in turn, I was the kid that was the closest in terms of our relationship, too, because I was the one that they saw more often. I deal with this now with my own children. I have an oldest son and a daughter-in-law and 3 grandkids that are out in Colorado. I don't see them. And there's times when it's a little bit on the gut-wrenching side where you go, what can I do to change it? But then there's other times where you just become resigned to the circumstances, and I guess the terminology that people use sometimes is the hand that you've been dealt. And the hand that I've been dealt in that relationship is that I hooked up with a woman whose family was in Colorado and they had very strong ties there. And my oldest son has naturally had a much stronger bond with his mother, maybe 10 times stronger than his bond with me and his brothers by me, than he's had with me. And subsequently, I have, I guess some people call them Skype grandbabies. I think we FaceTime when I see them. I send them gifts every time it's their birthday and everything, but I don't have the same relationship with my 3 grandchildren via my oldest son that I do with my grandchild, Michelle, who lives close by, and I see her at least once a week. And, I'm Papa, and we just really enjoy our time together. And I don't doubt that if my oldest son, Tim, and his kids and his wife live closer, that we wouldn't have a bond. We would probably have a very strong bond. But we don't. And so we don't. And I don't have the kind of money to go out there on a regular basis. Just like going back to my sisters, you got one in Dallas, you got one in Atlanta, and their mom's in Albion. And so they didn't really have the opportunity to spend a ton of time with Mom. So the responsibility in terms of her, when it came to any kind of decisions, if she got into financial trouble, if she got into trouble with her health, that fell back on me and to a large extent to Tracy, my wife, who Tracy and I were married in 2008, and to her credit, my mother was really, really difficult to deal with for for the in-laws, I should say. So like my spouse, she wasn't into the spouses, even my sister's spouses. She liked the blood kids. She wasn't real happy with the in-laws, but my wife Tracy had the patience of a saint when it came to my mother. And to the point, I mean, it was a combative relationship, but certainly I think that Tracy, in dealing with my mother, dealt with her coming from a place of her love for me. So even in as much as my mother wasn't always the greatest person to my wife was great to my mom because she knew how much my mom meant to me. And I don't know that I've ever said that before. So it's a shame my wife doesn't listen to these podcasts because that was a beautiful moment. But and I'll tell you, when my mom died, right in in her last days, and she shared all these beautiful, expressive moments with people that were close to her. And I actually, when I was doing stand-up comedy, I used to do this as a bit. It's a true story. My mother and I were super close, and we'll kind of get into that in just a moment. But, my mother had these exchanges with everybody. And she said to Tracy, and she thanked her for everything and kind of apologized for all these horrible things that had happened throughout their relationship. And she just said, hey, I know how much you mean to my kid and how much you've done to me, and I love you and all that stuff. And that was the last conversation she had with my wife. And the last thing that she said to me was now I've struggled with my weight, which will be an entire podcast episode at some point at the suggestion of my sister. But right before my mom had died, I mean, it was a hell of a year. I broke my leg, and I had been running marathons and half marathons. And so when I broke my leg, I just became very sedentary, and I just ate like an asshole. And I gained 70, 80 pounds. I mean, I'm not even exaggerating, in short order. So my mom's last words to me were, you're getting fat. and it's funny in a weird way. And I think it kind of encapsulates our relationship, because, when you care about somebody, you're going to be able to say things and make observations. And not that I didn't know that I was getting fat, but mom, in her last words and to me, I mean, that was it. And, but the reality is our final moments together, really the most poignant moments that we had, most poignant moment we had as she was dying was, we had, made the decision that she was going into hospice, and she was in the hospital. And they had to transport her from the regular hospital to the hospice home. And she really just didn't want to go. Really didn't want to go. And I'll never forget that ambulance ride. We were in there, and she just kind of looked at me, and she's like, yeah, this is it. This is it. This is like. And there's a song by Todd Rundgren, who's my favorite musician, called "The Last Ride." And if you get a chance to listen to it, it's a beautiful, beautiful song. And it has such different meaning for me. I always think of that last ride like the last ambulance ride, and that's not what the song's about. It's about a relationship that's ending, which I suppose in some way the relationship with my living mother was ending, but the relationship with her has never ended. But yeah, she said that, and I tell you, the thing that was haunting is that she had her eyes. I'd never really looked at her eyes up to that point. She had these beautiful, beautiful blue eyes, just like it looked like those pictures that you see of the earth, man. Just this incredible blueness to them. And they had this film over them because just the age thing, and she'd been losing her sight, and as she got older, but man, just these giant eyes, and they kind of looked they looked up and her eyes were just, they just looked big. They looked really big. And I'll never forget that. It was the most intense thing that I've ever seen. And I just kind of stared at him for a while. And it was one of those moments where you just don't know what to say. I mean, what do you say? What do you say? I just held her hand. I looked in her eyes, and it was just a very quiet ride to the hospital. Now, the kind of weird, hopeful epilogue to that ambulance ride is my mother, those eyes, I saw them again when my granddaughter was born. I mean, literally when my granddaughter was born, the first thing I noticed was the eyes. And they're a different color. So this is what makes it even more bizarre. But there's a certain quality in my granddaughter's eyes, who her middle name is Elizabeth. And she was born about a year after my mom passed. And I don't know, there's just, I can't even describe it, but she does this thing with her eyes where she looks upwards and her eyes just get really big. And it's a very prominent feature. I mean, people that see my granddaughter will say this. And I know that, you know, grandparents are always like very braggadocious when it comes to their grandchildren. Man, I'm so glad I got to use that word braggadocious twice in one podcast. She's a beautiful girl. And you know what? Anybody out there listening that has a granddaughter, your granddaughter is beautiful too. They are. They absolutely are. All your grandkids are beautiful because it's a beautiful thing to be a grandparent. But her eyes, every now and then, and even just as recently as like last week, she just did some things with her eyes. My granddaughter did. And I just was like, I literally just saw my mom. And on some level, it was very comforting because, you know, I had a conversation with my son, Trevor, once and recently, and he talked about the fact that he was an atheist. And I was like, damn, I don't even know how to feel about this. You're an atheist. You know, atheist is like, nah, no God, no nothing. And I was there was a part of me that felt really guilty that as his dad, that I'd raised this atheist. And I said, well, doesn't it scare you, you know, that you die, you got nowhere to go, that there's no God? And he said to me, no, it's actually very comforting. It's very comforting to know that I don't have to worry about that because when I die, I just die. And it's like, whoa, that's a really intense way to look at things. But as strange as it sounds, it gave me an entirely new perspective on how an atheist thinks. So, and you know, you may think that up to this point we've meandered because certainly there's been a lot of topics that we've touched on this. Let's see where we're at time wise. So I'm 18 minutes into the podcast and we've kind of wandered all over the place and whatnot. But I guess that's kind of what makes this work, I hope. But yeah, Trevor, I mean, and what's fascinating too is that, you know, when my mom passed, I mean, Trevor was the last person that she acknowledged. He was my youngest son, Trevor. I'll back up in case I didn't mention who he is. He's my youngest son. And as my mom was passing away in hospice, I was there. My son, Tom, was there. My wife, Tracy, and, you know, some friends and whatnot came in. And, but Trevor was really the last person that she had any real communication with, like for any extended period of time. And right before she died, he was really the last person that she recognized. And he had a hard time of it, as I remember. And he wound up breaking up with his girlfriend not long after that and just spiraled into this deep depression. So, on some level, I was kind of surprised by the whole atheist comment because, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe just seeing somebody die like that and had a profound experience on him. And my mother, now when my mother died, I had, the night before she passed, I mean, they had given her 3 to 6 months to live, and she wound up lasting like 4 days. And, back to that ambulance ride. I mean, I could tell that when she was taking the ambulance ride to the hospice that she knew it was over. And she wasn't going to fight it. And she just was kind of resigned to the fact that that it was her time to go. And she didn't want to go. I mean, I know that. She told me that all the time. And so the night before, I just sensed that she was ready to die. Well, not that she was ready, but that her body was showing signs that she was going to pass away. And I didn't want to leave her alone. So we were getting ready to go home, and I said to Tracy, my wife, I was like, no, I'm like, I got to stay. Like, I don't want to, like, I just don't want her to die alone. That's a horrible thought. It's horrible. And I'll tell you, during the whole COVID pandemic, when I heard these stories about people that couldn't be close to their loved ones as they were dying, I mean, it just, every time I heard these stories, it just gave me nightmares. And I'll tell you, I spiraled into a very deep state of depression over it. You know, probably, maybe, I don't know, it was probably about a year ago now. I mean, borderline, like I look back on that time, and it was borderline psychosis. I mean, I was getting a little nutty. The depression and anxiety and everything that was related to that, and the stress, really just caused my wiring to cross, and it was a tough time. And I'm glad I was able to get out of it without too much damage. But yeah, if there's any point to this particular podcast, going back to my mom, here I was. I mean, we just wound up having a very, very close relationship, and that's good and bad, because when you have a close relationship with somebody, they pass away. It's hard. I was on a committee with a gentleman, and he was in his late 60s, maybe even early 70s, and his mom was pushing 100, and she passed away. And he showed up to the committee meeting, and he was pretty upset. And after the guy left, somebody said, "Oh, why he's upset?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, because his mom passed away." And I said, "Well, how old was she?" And he's like, "I don't know, 90 something. Maybe she was maybe even 100 years old." And I maybe I had that same thought that other people have. I mean, I don't know. I just said, "Wow, well, that's a great run. Like, how do you feel bad about somebody that lived that long and passed away?" And the guy said to me something that really stuck to me. He said, he was a guy named Lou Beckerman. I don't know whatever happened to Lou. I should look him up. And he looked at me and he says, "Tom, sometimes it's harder when somebody passes away, even when they're older, because if you think about it, they've been a part of your life that much longer." And I was like, damn, that's true. I mean, I never really thought about it that way. I mean, there's really not like this. I mean, as much as, I had an aunt who passed away at 104, my Aunt Martha, and her son at the eulogy, he said, "Hey, we don't need to be sad. I mean, she had a great life. She was 104. I mean, the woman was a widow for 56, 57 years. I mean, that's crazy. Never remarried, nothing." But there was a sadness in his voice, and I think it was tough to say, like, what do you say? Oh, somebody dies at 104. You say, "Oh my God, it's such a tragic death. They died at such a young age." As I said, sometimes we just become desensitized to, like, well, I mean, if you think about it, even with this whole COVID thing, I had a brother-in-law that passed away, and he was, in his early 60s, and got COVID, passed away, and almost to a person, people say, "Oh, well, what happened to your husband?" "Oh, to my sister-in-law, they said, "Well, what happened to your husband?" "Well, he passed away of COVID." "Oh, well, did he have any underlying conditions?" I'm like, what does that matter? The guy died of COVID. It's tragic. he didn't need to die. You know, he caught this horrible disease. So, but it's weird because we're kind of conditioned. We're like, we put this value on death. Like, oh, you know, how old was your mom when she passed? My mom was 83. Well, she had a good run. Well, sure, she had a good run. But I wish it was longer. I mean, if she was here today and, you know, and by the same token, I know there's circumstances that are extenuating. I mean, I've talked to people that have had parents who, with dementia and Alzheimer's and I guess those last years are just absolutely wretched. And not to name drop, I mean, but I interviewed, I do some freelance music writing, and I get to interview some great people, some great musicians, and interviewed David Cassidy from famous from the Partridge Family. And, you know, his stepmom was Shirley Jones, but his real mom was another lady. And, you know, I feel bad for not remembering her name right now, but his real mom, she died of Alzheimer's. And then David Cassidy wound up having a similar situation where he himself dealt with dementia in the last years of his life. And I interviewed him maybe at the early stages of his dementia. I mean, I've posted the interview somewhere online. If you look for, you know, Thom Jennings and David Cassidy, you'll find it. But the real moment that we connected was we were talking about each other's mothers. My mother was still alive at the time, but it was a weird situation where at the beginning we were talking and, you know, he was very guarded and very interview-ish, you know, like, oh, you know, you're a reporter, I'm a subject. And that's one of the reasons I really enjoy the Bagel Logic podcast, because we don't have to have that facade or that game where, you know, we go back and forth and you're suspicious of my questions and I'm suspicious of your motives of what you're trying to promote. But, you know, he let his guard down when he started talking about his mom, and he was talking about his mom's Alzheimer's, and he just said, yeah, man, it was pretty horrible. And, you know, you don't wish your mom to pass, but many people that I talk to that have seen their parents deal with Alzheimer's and dementia, by the time the parents die, they're just emotionally exhausted. And it's almost a relief, which is so contradictory, because it's like, man, you know, your parent has just died. But I feel like it's almost like you've dealt with the grief earlier. I mean, you've lost them in their regular capacity earlier, and then the physical aspect comes so much later that you've already gone through the grief process. And I mean, I didn't have that. Mom had her faculties for the most part the last days of her life. And, you know, she went into the hospital on July 1st, 2016. She passed on July 18th, 2016, and 2016. And those were, man, I would say that over the course of my life, those were 18 of some of the most difficult days of my life. And I mean, I wouldn't wish that pain on anybody, man. Wouldn't wish that pain on anybody. It's tough. But you know, if I have any advice to give people, some of the things that I learned when it came to emotionally preparing for the passing of your parent is, you know, my mom, to her credit, she really had organized things. Like, over the years, we had just had these kind of throwaway conversations about, you know, here's where the deed is to the cemetery. You know, here's where I keep my checkbook. I remember when she had me sign a power of attorney. And they're weird conversations. And they're difficult conversations. They were more difficult for me than they were for her. I'm not a strong individual. She was a very strong individual. I hope my kid or my wife, one of my kids or my wife, is strong enough when the time comes for me to have the wherewithal to say, hey man, we need this, and we need the power of attorney or whatever. But I remember when she had me, she called me up and she says, yeah, I need to take it out of the attorney. I'm dealing with a will and I need you to sign a power of attorney. I need you to do this and I need you to do that. Now my mom's like, at this time, I think she's 78, 79 years old. And, my reaction's like, what the hell we need this for? Like, you're not going to die. Like, you don't die, Mom. You're my mom. Moms don't die. Not moms that are around. But man, it's it's sad because they do. And it as difficult as the situation was after she passed, at least having the paperwork and all the stuff that I needed in order, it was very helpful. Now, some of the other things that I can't do justice in describing her as a human being. I mean, she was a great lady. My dad, he was not the easiest guy to be married to, just like I'm sure I'm not the easiest guy to be married to at times, but I'm definitely easier than my dad was to be married to. But my mom was a very dedicated lady. She stuck with my dad literally through thick and thin. I mean, if there was ever somebody who could be held up as someone who really took her marriage vows seriously. And I suppose in some circles, some people would have called her weak because she stayed with somebody that she probably should have left by modern standards. It's funny because Hillary Clinton is one of those people I think of that was kind of damned if she did, damned if she didn't. Because everybody says, the only reason Hillary Clinton stayed with her husband is because she's an opportunist. And I would argue that sometimes it's more difficult to stay with somebody who you should leave than it is to leave them. My mom was not dependent on my father financially. She was the one that was really the breadwinner in the family. I mean, she did have a pretty horrible shopping habit, which I inherited in the form of record purchasing. But Mom liked to shop, but she did. She worked. She was a damn hard worker. And when my dad went on disability because of mental health reasons, and part of it related to his alcoholism and whatnot, and she went to work. That's what she did. She worked nights for a while, and then she worked days, but she worked. She worked full time, and she busted her ass. And it was sad when she died because I had access to all of her financial records, and I mean, she didn't have anything left. I couldn't. I guess that was maybe the one thing that I kind of wish that she hadn't hid from me, because even though I was dealing with my own, divorce and financial problems and everything like that. And, my mom always helped me out financially when I needed it. I mean, not to, some massive extent, thousands of dollars, but, the 50s here and the hundreds here or whatever. And, during the last years of her life, I returned the favor and whatnot, but I had no idea how close to the edge she was financially in the last 3 or 4 years. And it pisses me off to think that we live in a society where you get a lady like my mom, who, the woman never called in sick. She was a dedicated employee. She, her last employer she worked at for, close to 20 years. And, near the end, it was like they were screwing with her health insurance, and she was dealing with all kinds of, stuff with, I don't know if it's Medicaid or Medicare, one or the other. She had to live in a subsidized apartment. I just don't get it. I just don't get how you can kill yourself up to, and she didn't retire till she was 65. So how some people can work hard and bust their ass for a major corporation. She worked for a bank and have nothing left And yet other people can just game the system and retire at 55 and with this full pension until they're 90. Society's not fair. I guess that's the takeaway from that. And that's a double-edged sword in my mind too, because I think that it's tough to. It bothers me when people always say, we get a lot of that these days, like, student loan forgiveness. Well, why should you get your student loan forgiven if I didn't get, if I had to pay all mine, or I had to do this and I had to do that, But I get it, because that stuff with my mom really irritates the crap out of me. So, but yeah, if your mom's getting along in years, you kind of got to have that conversation with them and figure out where stuff is. And it doesn't have to be an intense thing, like, hey, let's schedule a Friday where I come over and we talk about your impending death. But man, Mom, as I said, in looking back, she handled it. She handled the whole thing really well. But I've always been traumatized by the fact that I did have the healthcare proxy. Because there was a moment, my mom, when, we talked about the 18 days. So she went into the hospital, and my mom, let me tell you, man, my mom was like, I don't know if you've ever seen the end of the movie Scarface, and Tony Montana's getting like shot up by 1,000 automatic weapons, and he somehow is living. I mean, that was just my mother. The woman survived breast cancer, skin cancer. I mean, she was just, she could fall down. She could break bones. She could do all kinds of stuff. And she'd spend a fair amount of time in the hospital, but she was usually just kind of it was always like a quickie trip. She'd go in, she'd get something fixed up. The breast cancer obviously was something more serious, and she had spent some time in hospital, and she had a mastectomy, and always like to show us her one fake boob. It was a weird thing. Mom was a weird lady. I'm a weird guy, so that's where I get it from. But yeah, but so here it was, I've kind of become accustomed to mom's sickness, mom's cycle of sickness, going to the doctor and getting diagnosed with something, and getting diagnosed with something bad, and then making it through it. She just seemed to always make it through it. And so with the liver, they did a biopsy on her liver, and man, let me tell you, the healthcare system, here's another thing that's just bizarre. So she was in a hospital in Buffalo, New York. It was just this big, nameless, ugly building. And they did the biopsy, and I think she kind of knew that the news could potentially be bad. And she said to me, she goes, listen, I don't want to hear this news alone. Like, I want you to be here, or I want somebody to be here when they tell me the results of the biopsy, whether it's positive or negative. And so I went to the charge nurse, and I said, hey, listen, mom's a sensitive type when it comes to cancer. She said a lot of cancer scares. She's been through it a few times. Everybody in her family died of cancer. She don't like cancer. She just don't like to hear it. So when do you guys plan on having the results of the biopsy? And they said, probably sometime tomorrow. I said, listen, can you just please, for me, call me? I'll leave work. I work 15 minutes up the road. Just let me come in, and I just want to be here when she gets the news. It didn't seem like a really big request. And so the next day I get a call at work. She's flipping out. She's like, oh my God, they came in this morning and they told me that it was positive. Blah, blah, blah. And it's one of those phone calls you dread. And with Mom, she'd go 0 to 3,000 in about a minute when she got bad news. Every word would turn into one long word, like a whole jumble of them. Like, I got to come something. I'm like, Mom, calm down. Tell me what's going on. They just came in this morning. I'm like, so at that point, I'm furious. I'm like, what the hell, man? Like, why couldn't you guys just wait? And that really pissed me off. But I think some of these big hospitals are just so damn insensitive. And I don't begrudge frontline healthcare workers. I get it. And I imagine that during COVID and everything, it was probably a very stressful time for them. But to me, that seemed like a pretty simple request. Don't have this conversation with my mom unless I'm there. And then I came in, I think my son Trevor came in, if I remember correctly. He came in. He was the first person to see her after she got the news, and she was really upset. And I got up there as soon as I could. I was tied up with something, and I got up to the hospital. And then this doctor came in, and this guy's like, sits down in a chair, and he opens up his clipboard, and he's like, looking over your test results, and doesn't look like we got any options. The cancer's metastasized, and you probably got 3 to 6 months to live. So this would be a good time to get your affairs in order. Do you have any questions? I'm just sitting there like, dude, whatever happened to the concept of bedside freaking manner? I don't know. I mean, maybe people out there listening and that are in the healthcare field, they just kind of get it, and maybe they're just so used to delivering bad news that it's become routine. But I don't know. I mean, I'm a history teacher, and I've studied the wars, and I remember reading about how soldiers would have to go to mothers' homes and tell them that their kids have been killed in battle, and they always picked guys that were somewhat sensitive so they could deliver the news to the family in a respectful way. But yeah, that was pretty brutal. And so when it came to the point where they basically said, hey, we got no options, and this is it, mom was like, yeah, I don't know, man, like, we got to do this, we got to do that. She just really wanted to explore all the options. And I guess that's where the guilt comes in, because I was ultimately the one that had to make the decision regarding hospice or treatment. And I mean, I was told under no uncertain circumstances that treatment was not an option. And then mom's like, hey, no, we got to try another hospital. We got to try this. We got to try that. And I remember it was just me and her having the conversation, and I just was like, Mom, there's nothing. Like, I wish if there was even a glimmer of hope in my mind, I would absolutely find a place to go for treatment. And I kind of felt like poor white trash at that point too. I felt like if I was a rich dude, that I could have found a place to help her through it. I don't know. Maybe that's just my guilt. I mean, I look at guy. Yeah, I don't know. It's this is the rambling part. This is the difficult part of the podcast. And then when they pulled me in the room, they started talking to me about the do not resuscitate order. And Mom had pretty much said, no, I don't want a DNR. Like if I go, I want to be resuscitated. And I said, all right, I'll talk to him, Mom. I'll talk to him. And the way it was presented to me was, it was like, well, if she goes and they have to resuscitate her, they're probably going to crush her ribs. She's going to wind up in the hospital. And she can't go into hospice if she doesn't have a DNR. If she's going to hospice, she has to have a DNR. And I'm like, well, she don't want a DNR. They're like, well, she can't go into hospice. She'll stay in the hospital. And the hospice place that she was going to go to was this, it was a nice place. I mean, it was more of a residential feeling. It didn't, wasn't, my mom hated hospitals. So I had to make a decision. And I don't know. I don't know if I made the right decision. I still don't. It's 6 years later. My sister and I had this conversation, not maybe, I don't know, a year or two ago, when I was intoxicated. Because, man, when I'm drinking, I definitely think about this in a bad way. And it's like, I just remember sitting there thinking, what? Like, this is life or death. This is a life or death decision. And they were like, listen, busted ribs, she's going to be in a lot of pain. She's going to be hanging out in a lot of pain. And I thought back to, in some ways, I thought back to that interview with David Cassidy where he just said, man, I just watched my mom suffer those last few months. I just wanted her to friggin' die because I didn't want her to be in pain anymore. And it does test your faith because, I mean, if you think about it, to me, like, I think, well, if I'm an atheist and she's just going to die, like, I mean, that's it. I mean, there's nothing. There's no seeing her in my granddaughter's eyes. There's a hopelessness behind that. And those are the kinds of things that sort of rushed into my head. And I signed it, and yeah, man, it's tough. And pretty much that July 1st through July 18th, the last 6 years it's been a tough ride for me emotionally. I mean, it's the 19th, which is probably the only reason I can record this podcast, because those even now, those 18 days are like, it's such an emotional roller coaster for me. There's just these, I feel like I'm just getting PTSD for that period of time. And again, a lot of that relates back to the whole DNR. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know what other decision I could have made. I don't. But I don't know. I mean, if I hadn't signed it, maybe the diagnosis was wrong. Because, you go into hospice, they take you off all your medications. And again, they told me she was going to last for, 3 to 6 months. And even my sisters, I said, hey, don't worry about coming out right away. She's got a little bit of time, get your travel plans and get out here when you can. No rush. And then neither one of my sisters got to see her before she passed because she went too quickly. And there's a part of me that feels the guilt behind that too, because maybe I should have seen the signs that she wasn't going to last that long, and I probably should have said, hey, get your ass out here, if you're going to spend that last minute with her before she passes. But yeah, so that's what we got today. Intense stuff. I mean, I know this is supposed to be kind of a form of entertainment, which but I think it's also important that, again, my goal with the podcast is, in as much as it's designed to be a form of entertainment, which it is at its core, that comes in the form of some authenticity and rawness to maybe let you know that if you're struggling with the types of things that I'm struggling with, that I've struggled with, you're not alone. I mean, we all struggle, but I think, and it's become apparent to me more even in the last 6 months that I've started doing this podcast, that people do have a really difficult time talking about difficult things. And, I'll close with this. My friend Jack Burris, he called me yesterday, and I was sitting in a parking lot, and I was really kind of at a low point, and the phone rings, and I picked it up. And now Jack, the morning my mother died, the morning of the day my mother died, he was pulling in the parking lot as I was going home to shower and stuff. And I remember he was the first one I really broke down in front of, in terms of, coming to the realization that that she was probably going to die that day. And it was huge comfort. And he called me, and he says, I answered the phone like, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer, like, hey man, what's up? I answered the phone like, hey, what's going on? And honestly, I always love him when he calls. I'm just happy. He's one of those guys, I don't talk to him every day, but, I'm sure you have those friends that if you talk to him every fourth or fifth day, and it's just nice to talk to him. I enjoy our conversations. It's always a treat when he picks up the phone when I call him, and he's always a treat when he calls me. And I don't need to say that to kiss his ass or anything. I mean, I love the guy as a friend. But he calls me, and we had some chatter, and he says, yeah, today's the day, and that. I was like, yeah. Yep. And we talked about some stuff, and we talked about that day and everything, but it was like, that's the kind of stuff that restores your faith in humanity. And if you take away nothing else from this podcast, from this particular episode of this podcast, if you've made it this far, if you got time to make a phone call to somebody on a day that may be difficult, whether it's, day their mom passed, day they lost a job, any of those types of things. It goes a long way, man. It's meaningful. It's intense. It's important. And you will be a blessing for that individual. And I try to be that guy. I do. I try to be that guy because I know what it means to me. And I have people in my life that do it for me, whether it's family or friends. But yeah, I needed that because I think the other thing is that there's a lot of, I think there's other people in my life that know that there's certain subjects that are very difficult for me to talk about on a one-to-one basis. And my mother's death is definitely one of them. I usually make jokes about it. I don't really talk about it very seriously because it is incredibly painful. But, I don't know. I guess I said it's my point is if you got time to reach out to somebody, man, those phone calls mean a lot to people. I know they mean a lot to me. And I know that I've been on the other end where I've just made a phone call to somebody and there's times where you just don't know what to say. But it's not about what you have to say. It's just about the fact that you're taking the time to acknowledge somebody's pain. In the same way, you call somebody up when they're feeling joy. Hey man, your kid just graduated school, your grandkid scored a goal in a soccer game, all that kind of stuff. And I'm glad I have people like that in my life. Back to my oldest son. I mean, I wish I had that kind of relationship with him where, we could call each other when we need each other. We just don't have that, but I can't change that. But who knows? Maybe that'll change at some point down the line. But that's all I got today. So if you made it this far, definitely not intending this to be just an entire bummer. So hopefully you got something out of it because I probably owe all of you an hourly fee for the therapy session today because this was an important episode for me. But until next time on the Bagel Logic Podcast, it's your host, Thom Jennings, saying thank you. Thank you for listening, really. Again, you today have all provided me comfort by just being there on the other end. And you know who you are. See you next time.